Greetings, peace, and power to everyone. Uh, really appreciate your attendance today. Make sure that you grab a pen and paper. Pen and paper is very necessary for this presentation because we're going to take you deep, deep inside the mind of international law professors. We're going to talk about the strategy of a confederation. And to begin that, we want to give you an idea of the starting point. The starting point in international law and what makes it different than domestic law is that international law takes into consideration more of a holistic event, especially when it comes to people. It takes into um, consideration their origin. So today we're going to talk about the origin of the African descendant people, of African Americans, Negroes, colors, what all of those names we're going to explain, and then we're going to go into what is a confederation. And as we go into what is a confederation and how confederations are formed for emerging states and how they can organize us, we want to preface that with the fact that a confederation is a peace treaty. So make sure that you have your pens and pencils ready. Make sure that you thoroughly understand what is being said today. If there's any questions, make sure that you let us know or study on your own so that you'll know how to explain this to someone else because this is new information that has been deprived from us. So let me go into the PowerPoint. The first PowerPoint, and it's the political strategy of a confederation and why we must confederate. Data is presented by our UN Human Rights Defender Cecile Johnson. Okay. First of all, we have to answer this question. This is a question that gives us standing in the international court because every court has to understand who you are. This is one of the reasons why the reparations cases failed because the parties there couldn't establish why they had standing to be before the court. Who they were to have standing to be before the court. And that's also the reasons for our declarations, because you give us standing to go before the international court. So first we must understand who we are. And who we are is very different from what you have been taught in the colonial schools for an apparent reason. Uh, there are one thing is that the last population wave, there was 4 population waves of Africans to this territory. The original population of Africans came 60 to 100,000 years ago, and they were known as the Paleo Americans. So when you look up the term Paleo Americans, that's Paleo Americans, that's us. Those were Africans who had walked out of East Africa, went through Southeast Asia. This is the population wave, first population wave, into the Malaysia, and in all these areas, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, all of these areas have still tribes of what they call Negritos. Um, in those areas, so we understand the population trail. We can prove it. It went into Australia. Australia was the tipping point into South America, that in Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea really means the land of the blacks. So that land that's right next to Australia means the land of the blacks. Those were the tipping points into South America over 100,000 years ago. That was the first population wave. How we traced this was through the attributes of bones, artifacts, and the like that have come over there, and the fact that 100,000 years ago there was no such thing as Caucasians. are Europeans. They only arrived on the earth about 65,000 years ago. Of course, we've been here for millions of years. Um, but the Europeans have only been here 65,000 years. So we know that 100,000 years ago, the people that came over into this area were Africans. They had morphed, and when you see the scientific studies, like we have seen the scientific studies, we hear this term morphological affinities. When they tested the bones, we see that these are morphological affinities. Um, and the morphological affinities are African, which this was first deduced in 1992. And so all of our textbooks and the African American Studies departments are woefully behind in the most important starting point, because this starting point gives us tremendous wealth, because indigenous people are entitled to land. People that have arrived, not people, but colonial people by force who arrived after that, have a different term, and put this term down because we'll be using it throughout our presentations. It's called belligerent occupiers. Those are people who by force belligerently unfortunately occupy an area. This is the Europeans. This is why the people called Indians and indigenous people in this that's connected to the United States. And we're talking about Guam, Puerto Rico, the American Indians. All of them have superior land titles, have superior rights to the land. So this update should be in our uh, African American Studies uh, uh, um, college courses, and it should be in the political science courses, and it should be in our law courses, international law courses, because it's very important. We also have deduced recently that there were, according to the ship logs, that there were only 388,000 Africans who were captured in that race war, which is called the transatlantic slave trade. And we have to, and the transatlantic slave trade is a euphemism, or a nice way to say that that this was a war, because anytime there's an invasion of your land, you are fight and you are taken from the areas that you were in, that is what we call an act of war. So in international law, this thing called the transatlantic slave trade is a war. So African descendants are prisoners of war. And this is what we present to the international bodies. They totally understand that we are prisoners of war. And so so the terms that we are using, I want you to really understand, and so you'll understand later why we are using the Geneva Convention, and why we're using the Convention on Indigenous Rights and Indigenous Resources, so that you can understand the argument and why the argument is so sound. The African descendants in the USA are of two origins. Well, actually, a merged origin. The first is the figures on your left. These are things that were are artifacts that we have, that were dug up. Most famous one, I think, is that of the colossal Olmec heads that were found in Mexico, near Veracruz. So if you ever get a chance to visit Veracruz, make sure that there's about 6 to 8 sites where these huge, gigantic heads with braids. If you look around the back of the braids, we see Ethiopian locks. That's the reason why we know that these are our people. And the summation is that during ancient times, the Mediterranean served as a conveyor belt to the Americas, which was the second population wave. Um, Again, the African Americans, or the African descendants, are made up of 4 population waves. That was the second population waves, because even around the Olmec sculptures, we see Kufic language. Kufic language is language from the Nile. It's language from the our lands, the Black lands, Nubia, in Egypt. So the script that we find that and artifacts that we find around the Olmec scrolls, Olmec statutes are Kufic. We also find Phoenician skulls around, and the Phoenicians are also of African descent, African Mediterranean descent. So, it's really makes a lot of sense because, and of course, to Dr. Ivan Van Sertima and others, that and Thor Heyerdahl, that the oceans, and this is another way to determine the pathway to the Americas, the oceans are like a big conveyor belt because of these things called currents. So anything that goes, if you go out of West Africa in anything, and Thor Heyerdahl tested this with a papyrus boat, and that's like a boat made of straw almost. It's heavily woven straw papyrus. It came to America. It came to the Gulf. Came to the islands right before the Americas. So and in a short period of time, 51 days. So it doesn't take a long time to go from Africa to the Americas because of the powerful current. These currents are served as conveyor belts. This was the second population wave to the Americas. So that is the second layer of our descent. The third layer are along with the Egyptians are the Malians, and we don't have that here, but the Malians, in their texts, of course, we all know of Mansa Musa, the wealthiest person in the world ever. He had a uncle who was on the throne, but he was an adventurer, and he abdicated the throne. He gave the throne to Mansa Musa. If you can imagine that, how wealthy and how powerful the Songhai nation was, and that's the Mali dynasty. And please look up the Mali dynasty. The gentleman that I'm speaking of that came to the Americas in around 1300 was Abu Bakr, Abubakr, and he came to the Americas in between 1,200 and 2,000 boats. So if you can imagine the extreme wealth that we had and erudition, they had universities. We had some of the early universities in the world way before the Europeans had universities. In fact, we spurred, and they'll never tell you this, but unless you really ask and inquire and really study, that we spurred the European Renaissance because they were they were pretty much uncivilized. And but we had an erudition. The Songhai dynasty was like about 85 to 95% literate, and that's more than what we have currently today because of the decrepit school system that we have. And we'll get into that in our next lecture, how our children have been deprived of a wonderful education. But in any case, that's the third population wave. Then the other population wave, the one that we have been taught about and hammered in, that we were taught was the only population that was available to us, was 388,000 Africans, enslaved Africans in that war, who came to the Americas over a period of 200 years. But if you divide 200 into 388,000, that gives you only about 1,600 new enslaved Africans per year. So what's missing from this dynamic is the fact that, well, how did we expand to 4 million by the end of the Civil War if we only had 388,000? Well, it's called miscategorizations. The people called Indians were very, very dark, and they were are misinterpreted to be the people from India and Southeast India, who were very, very dark too, which wasn't far off because some of that Southeast Asian blood mixed with the African blood and became morphologically, this is the morphological affinities, became the peoples who inherited the Americas, who came into the Americas early on. So this is who the African descendants are. They descended from these four populations. The not, I don't want to say mystery, but we know that the miscategorizations of the Europeans by legislation such as the one drop rule. That's the rule that if they can detect one drop of African blood, then they're going to give you a connotation as a Negro or colored or mulatto or one of those category or colored. Now, mulatto, mixed, colored, and colored, and I forgot the other one that I just said, but these also show you that these are new populations because they have, even the Europeans have given them new categories as colored, Negro even, okay, colored, Negro, mulatto, and the other one escapes me. But these are actually prove one of our points that we're indigenous because these people were created on American soil. The other thing is that what has been left out of our text is that there was a huge breeding frenzy going on the plantations, uh, and which mixed different tribes together, mixed different Indians together with the native people would, because when the Africans first came here, the only people enslaved and had been enslaved from, another thing that they left out from, and these are these black periods that I want you to know and research from 1492 until 15, 16, and then to 16, about 1630s. The only people that were enslaved in the Americas were the people called Indians. So when we arrived in the fourth population wave in force in 1636, because in 1619 it was only about 30 that came over in that ship, and they were not really slaves, and they were more, they had a different status. Well, they weren't enslaved for life. So until 1636, 1670, there was a lot of mixing going on those plantations because most of the Africans that came here were men, and and some children, and a percentage of females. But there was a shortage of females here, and of course, the only people, most of the people that were enslaved at the time that we came were Indian native women, because the men were being shipped to places like the Caribbean and Europe. Some other facts that were left out. So in this milieu of this colonial mixing pot, we came out of that, and when we came out of that with a status that was unknown to us because we didn't know that people originating in a certain place on a certain soil under international law were indigenous to that soil, because everybody has to have some type of national identity, some type of national mix. That's just how it is, because everybody's born somewhere. So because we were born here, out of this milieu, that gives us the international legal argument that we are indigenous. And I know you're not going to get that from a lot of different people. And the only reason why you're getting it from me is because I like the other authors, Dr. David Imhotep, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and Dr. Clyde A. Winters, who's one of the leading authorities. They are experts on this milieu and on the population trails, but they are not experts on international law. So my addition to this is when you put the international law framework on it and their status as to who these people are, our argument in international courts, and we know that it's going to be recognized, and I'll show you in these slides, defining indigenous status. And and Jose Martinez Cobo is what we call a special reporter. They call it, you'll see, rapporteur. That's just a French name for reporter. And he, over the period of about, I think it was about 6 to 8 years, did a huge survey on who indigenous people are. And indigenous communities, this is the first bullet point, and by the way, there's no real agreement on all the definitions, but we'll go over them and you'll see how we fit into them because of our, the story and this of how we arrived here in the ensuing milieu. Indigenous communities, people, and nations are those which have a historical continuity. Put down historical continuity because it's very important. And that's the first element that we'll prove, and that's the one that I've been talking about in historical continuity with the soil, with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies. We have a historical continuity with the pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies who were African, who came from our areas in Africa that was of our descent, and who formed the first people in this in the Americas, and developed on the territories, considered themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies not prevailing in those territories or parts thereof. They form a present non-dominant sector of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories. Let's stop there. This is one of the reasons that we're using the strategy of the Confederation, because we are in need of our ancestral territories. Why? And territory or land is the basis of wealth and our ethnic identity. Put another pin in there and stop. We have been fumbling around because we didn't know who we are, what we are. We've been called all these different names, and without realizing that these names carry with them a legal status with them. And so when we say indigenous status, that means a lot. That means billions and billions of dollars that are our rights, our wealth, our indigenous wealth that should be transmitted to us because of this status, because we have a unique status on this soil. Apart from the factors, we want to transmit to our children and their ethnic identity, because right now we can't transfer or even explain our ethnic identity to our children. And we can't build social institutions or legal systems truly unless we really understand who we are. Because all of that is a part of law. Law is a dynamic concept that takes into consideration of the identity of the person before the bench. Okay. A historical continuity may consist of the continuation for an extended period reaching into the present, us, of one or more of the following factors: occupation of ancestral lands, or at least part of them, of course. If we look at the maps, I think we have a couple here, we'll see that we have occupied ancestral lands, especially in the Black Belt. But we have occupied all of America from the southeast Atlantic coast to California. These are all Black Indians. If you go into Arizona, California, and you do your research, you'll see that the first populations there looked like us. They were Black indigenous people. And so that information has been left out of our textbooks, our colleges, and so our children see a great irrelevancy in the books, and it turns them off because they don't see themselves. They see George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, slave traders, and it turns them off, and it makes them feel, and makes us feel inferior, as if we had no part in the making of this society. Self-identification as indigenous is also regarded as a fundamental element in the working condition. That's the reason for, excuse me, the declaration. I'm going to go to the next slide. um, and this is the same. We'll make sure that it's going to be on the replay as well. Make sure that you get these definitions down, because a lot of people, as you know, are talking about indigenous this and indigenous that, and really don't know. It's the same thing when we were talking about reparations this and reparations that, and we don't really know. That's why we have this textbook here, this legal treatise on how to obtain reparations, what it is, and how to obtain it. And make sure that you get a copy. It's the process, civil rights and human rights, and it's a legal treatise on on reparations. And we look at the models of the Jewish model, and then we dispel myths as that we can get it into the that reparations can come by going into a U.S. court, which is not really thoughtful, because the U.S. courts and the U.S. Congress are the people who are the defendants. They are the ones who harmed us. So that's really not that bright. So again, take these slides down. This is again the definitions in a real succinct manner from 1 through 6. In fact, this is probably the most succinct way to understand who we are, and the fact that we're indigenous. And remind yourself that we only have to really meet one of these elements, and we meet all of the elements. Self-identification as indigenous is also regarded as a fundamental element. So we have to change our language and our understanding of ourselves. There are, until about 5 years ago, when I and the other professors began to go on social media, began to go on talk shows and talk about the fact that we're indigenous, we had no idea. And now it's being picked up by people who have not studied properly, and so they don't understand what you just have went through. They don't understand the legal elements and fundamental evidence of who indigenous people are. Then you have the people that have been programmed by our African studies professors, and I'm going to say it in a bad way, but there was a big emphasis on us being African, and we are African. We're descendants of the Africans, but we have a lot more going on inside of us, and we have to recognize who we are, and who we are is all those things that are going on inside of us. All those tribes, all of those experiences, even the European experiences, all of that means something, and where it took place at, it means something legally. So we really have to understand these elements. So please get these elements down, so when someone asks you, or if you have questions yourself on what an indigenous person is and whether or not we're indigenous, go to your elements, because this is what counts, not people's opinion. The law, the legal elements is what count. This is like 12 volumes of work over the last over 6 or 8 years by the special reporter of the Subcommission of Human Rights, Jose Martinez Cobo. Get his name down in case you lose anything else. If you look up his name, you'll see his report. And the report is, this is a synopsis of 12 volumes of work. Now, because of all of this, we have been what we call colonized. Not what we call colonized, but the legal elements of colonization. And so we talk about that, the belligerent occupancy. Colonization is a process. It refers to the transitional period following invasion and preceding the cessation of hostilities. This is what we have been living under since the European invasion and colonization. And colonization is a process by which a central system of power dominates the surrounding land and its component. This term is derived from the Latin word colere, which means to inhabit. They've inhabited our areas. Now, let me give you a um, a really good YouTube video. And I don't want to throw you off in any kind of way because it's an animation, but I want you to really understand the animation. I mean, really understand the contents of this. I'm gonna give you a 9-minute video, YouTube video. I'm gonna give you a 10-minute, a little over 10-minute video. Now, what it's going to explain is why we're using the Confederation, why we're using this structure. And it's a very powerful structure. It's pre-European. It's a pre-European structure. We've used it all over the Americas. We used it. This is going to talk about the structure that was first used along Lake Michigan and on the Great Lakes. But with this structure was used with the creek. The creek was very dark, and we're talking about Florida, northern Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and then we're going to talk about the Choctaw. And the Choctaw Confederation is also in that area. So look up, check down the Creek Confederation. This is how power is done. This is why we're using this strategy, because of a number of reasons. We have war in our own communities. Chicago, in which the community which I'm from, last week we shot each other over 60 times with I think about 13 or 14 fatalities. We need a peace treaty amongst ourselves. So a confederation is a peace treaty. In this YouTube video, you're going to see one of our ancestors, one of our long ancestors called Hiawatha. You probably heard that name before and really didn't understand the substance of Hiawatha. Very intelligent brother. Very intelligent. And you're going to see Totonde. He was a warring chief. And this is going to be synonymous. That's what's going on in our cities. Anytime that we get in a scuffle with each other, we fight each other, we kill each other, we shoot each other, we curse each other, we cuss each other. We can't have that to be successful against the colonizers. We have to have peace among ourselves. So this great effort of the Confederation, this is why it's made up of all different denominations, all different. We have Muslims, we have Moors, we have Indian tribes, we have lawyers, black lawyers, we have all kind of different configuration. We have individuals that number in the thousands now that have that are beginning to understand, and we're just now getting this information to them because. So, and you're gifted by being one of the first ones who've gotten this in-depth information about what a confederation is, because they were just so disgusted at what was going on and our loss of power and how we're being abused that they wanted to get out of America. So our appeal of getting out of America, of separating, having our own independence is what appealed to them. Now we're explaining to them how we're going to do it, how we're going to make peace in Chicago, how we're going to take over Chicago, how we're going to take over the Black Belt in those areas. This piece is going to show you how we're going to do it. And I want you to be very attentive to what's going on, and it's going to amaze you. It's going to really amaze you. So let me find the part one. Okay. And again, don't be put off by the animation, but it's very, very well put together as to how and what a confederation is and how it works and how it's worked for people all over the world, including the United States.
Before Europeans arrived on what they would name North American soil, 5 nations came together and formed a confederacy. They were guided by the will of the people, and they created a constitution with 117 articles that guaranteed the rights of the people and the responsibilities of their leaders. That constitution, the Great Law of Peace, still guides those people to this day. So who are they? Well, those Europeans we mentioned would call them Iroquois, but that's not really their name. They are the Haudenosaunee, people of the Long House. We don't know exactly when they formed their confederacy, only that it certainly came before the arrival of the Europeans, perhaps by as much as a millennium. We also know the name of one of its founders, Hiawatha. When Big Huge Games told us that they planned to add Hiawatha as a great leader in their game dominations, we got pretty excited. The Confederacy he formed is an incredible piece of history of governance, one that has survived for centuries and played an acknowledged role in shaping the United States Constitution. And when we asked Big Huge Games if they would be interested in sponsoring 2 episodes about Hiawatha's role forming the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they got pretty excited. So here we go. But first, a disclaimer. Much of the evidence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's foundation has been handed down through the oral tradition, and where history privileges the written word, a culture that keeps its history through sacred stories will often be left out of the prevailing narrative, or worse, told that they have no history at all. The Haudenosaunee very much have a history, and it's a living history characterized by a variety of perspective and expression. Our goal here isn't to mandate one principal story that must be believed above all others, but to relate one story of Hiawatha as a lens to learn about the living, real, and vital Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Our story begins in Onondaga territory, in a time when people who had once been brothers warred with each other. A chief named Tadodaho led the Onondaga into battle after battle. He was ferocious to the point of viciousness, and although he won many battles, his victories never brought peace, and his lust for violence only grew stronger. The lesser chiefs of his tribe lived in fear of him, and Tadodaho treated them like scum, whose only purpose was to praise and obey him. But one of them did not. His name was Hiawatha. Hiawatha was grieving. His wife had been taken from him by raiders long ago. 2 of his daughters had died of illness that couldn't be cured, and then his 3rd daughter, whom he cherished and tried to protect, died in a tragic accident. Hiawatha found himself looking back on a lifetime of war with regret. This sorrow he felt must surely be shared by everybody who had lost a child or a loved one. War seemed to him like the worst cause of this grief, since unlike illness or misfortune, war could be avoided. At least he believed it could be. He called a council of all the Onondaga chiefs, including Tadodaho, to propose a peace. According to stories he'd heard, their brother tribe, the Mohawk, had embraced a peaceful way of life, and were no longer waging war on anyone. Hiawatha said, if we unite with them, we can protect each other. We'll have no more need of war. Tadodaho hated that idea. War was his identity. It was the foundation of his power. Everyone who looked up to him did so because they feared his strength. He told Hiawatha that if he liked this Mohawk peace so much, maybe he should go live with them. And the remaining chiefs, cowed by Tadodaho, didn't disagree. So Hiawatha left. He traveled to the current home of the Mohawks and sought the man he'd heard stories about, the man who had convinced them to give up their warring ways and embrace peace. His grandmother had given him a different name, but now everybody called him the Peacemaker. Hiawatha waited patiently outside the walls of the Mohawk village where the Peacemaker lived until the Peacemaker came to him. When they met, Hiawatha gave him a string of shining purple and white beads called wampum. The white ones represented peace, he said, and the dark ones represented war. So he had created a string with white beads on either side of the dark beads to show his desire for peace to overcome war. The Peacemaker had never before seen wampum used to convey a message, and he liked this stranger immediately. The Peacemaker welcomed Hiawatha into his longhouse. When he heard what Hiawatha had proposed among the Onondaga, his face lit up. But as they talked, it became clear that he didn't want just the Onondaga and the Mohawk to be allies. He believed all people could live together in peace, as the Creator intended. Of course, he and Hiawatha agreed that the easiest place to start would be with the 5 nations who already shared similar languages: the Onondaga, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Going back to Tadodaho would be pointless, Hiawatha knew. He would never listen, because he never listened to anything but power. They needed allies. They would need to recruit the other nations first. But how? The other nations didn't know him. They wouldn't listen to him. They needed somebody who could reach out to the chiefs of every nation. They needed someone whom the warriors wouldn't attack on sight. They needed Jigonsase. She had become something of a legend among the warriors. Her longhouse stood at a crossroads, and many warriors sought refuge with her on their marches. She was a Seneca woman, but she allowed anyone to stay in her longhouse as long as they agreed to keep her peace. Often, when warriors of different nations came to her on the same day, she would feed them dinner from the same soup bowl. Tradition dictated that anybody who shared food became kin, and they were forbidden to fight each other. Thus, in her own way, Jigonsase had been forging small alliances across the 5 nations for years. They visited Jagonsase at her longhouse, and the peacemaker explained that he wanted to build one just like it, one that brought together all 5 nations under one great law of peace. Women like her would be the backbone of this new peace, because women were keepers of the earth and leaders of the clans. Clan mothers would be empowered to choose the chiefs, to remove them if they failed in their responsibilities, to call councils, and to review new laws. He asked Jagonsase to be his messenger to the women's councils in all the nations, and to bring his message of righteousness, health, and power. And she replied, "That is indeed a good message. I take hold of it. I embrace it." Together, she and Hiawatha journeyed to the nearby tribe of the Oneida as envoys of the peacemaker's message. The Oneida were the little brothers of the Mohawk, so they were more inclined than anyone else to accept the peace which the Mohawk now embraced. Those who knew Jagonsase trusted her, and welcomed her and Hiawatha among them as speakers who relayed the peacemaker's message. Then the great debate began. The Oneida had suffered plenty from the war, but could they really afford to put aside their weapons and trust peace to protect them? The elders argued that peace had been the way of their people since the land had been given to them. That was the past, though, and now they had many warriors who lived to fight, and enemies who wanted to destroy them. Arguments were levied on both sides, and the discussion raged for a full year. But the peacemaker was insistent. War was an aberration, a betrayal of the wishes of the Creator, and of the interests of the people. If they wanted to be strong, truly strong, they would have to lead the way with their own choices. They must choose peace. They owed it to all of the casualties of war whose bones lay in the ground, whose futures had been cut short. They owed it to themselves to make a new future. They could live without fear if they learned to put hatred aside and unite with a new strength of purpose. Once they embraced peace, others would follow, and they would all gather strength like a ball in the snow. His passion impressed the Oneida, and his arguments won them over. Finally, they agreed. The first treaty of the Great Law of Peace had been formed. Inspired by their success, Hiawatha wanted to return to the Onondaga with this message, and the news that 2 tribes had now embraced it. Tatodaho enjoyed his power, but surely he couldn't stand against 2 tribes united in peace. The peacemaker was willing, but Jagonsase had her doubts. She had heard terrible stories about Tatodaho, his cruelty in war, and his violence toward the women of his own house. "He has an evil heart," she said. "Men like him could never be brought to peace." The peacemaker replied, "It is exactly men like him that I must speak to." So together they journeyed back to the Onondaga, where Hiawatha called together a council. Tatodaho sat across from the peacemaker, and did not listen. Once again he told them that he had no interest in peace, and he wouldn't tolerate any further negotiations. If the Mohawk and the Oneida wanted to embrace this great law of peace, fine for them. That just meant they would leave him alone so he had fewer enemies to defeat, and he had every intention of continuing to make war on his enemies. Hiawatha left this council in low spirits, but the peacemaker's hopes remained bright. He told Hiawatha to keep thinking about how to bring Tatodaho around to the idea of peace, and in the meantime, the 3 of them would set out for the lands of the next tribe on their list, the Cayuga. Just as the Oneida were the little brothers of the Mohawk, the Cayuga were the little brothers of the Onondaga. They had suffered greatly from Tatodaho, who treated them poorly but demanded that they fight in his wars. They could never refuse for fear that Tatodaho would turn his much larger force against them. To them, an alliance with the Mohawk and the Oneida sounded like the perfect way forward. The chiefs readily agreed, and joined the Great Law of Peace. Now they had taken an ally from under Tatodaho's control. They had diminished him. Perhaps they could remove him from power entirely, but that wasn't what the peacemaker wanted. He needed the people to unite, to choose peace, and to come together like a family. In a family, no one was beyond saving. Luckily, Hiawatha now had a plan. Join us next week as the peacemaker and his speakers return to confront Tatodaho and bring the last of the 5 nations together under the Great Law of Peace. Thank you again to Dominations for sponsoring Extra History and making these episodes possible. To play Dominations, go to your Google Play or iOS App Store, or click the link in
That was part 1. Again, this is about peace between the people in Chicago, our people in Mississippi, our people in New Jersey, all over our country. We need to have a united peace with all of our people. This is what makes us strong. We have 45 million people if united, because we're always talking about we need to unite. This treaty of peace, and I'm going to show you a treaty of peace right after finishing part 2 of this very explicit video. This is part 2.
3 nations had now agreed to join the Great Law of Peace, but there were 2 more in the peacemakers' sights, the Seneca and the Onondaga. Both were powerful nations, renowned in war, and they had every reason to reject a peace that asked them to lay down their weapons. War might come at a great cost, but it also kept them safe from their enemies, and it gave them power. The Seneca had more warriors than any other nation, including the Onondaga. They had battled Tadadaho many times, repeatedly checking his ambition with their own. But he was far from their only enemy. They fought many wars outside the 5 nations which the peacemakers sought to unite, and to support those wars, they frequently raided their neighbors. Many of the envoys who now followed the peacemaker had suffered or lost loved ones in Seneca raids. Hiawatha and the peacemaker came braced for an argument, but they were greeted warmly. The Seneca had already heard of the peace treaty. Jigonsase, who was Seneca herself, had sent her own messengers explaining the principles of righteousness, health, and power that had convinced her to join the peacemaker. Aside from 2 chiefs who lived to the far west, the Seneca were ready to accept the treaty. But those 2 chiefs had the most warriors, and the most reason for not accepting the treaty. They lived on the border. A peace treaty among the 5 nations would protect the chiefs in the interior, but not them. If outsiders came to threaten the Confederacy, they would be the first to fall. The peacemaker called together all the envoys to discuss what they should do. None of them had participated in a council like this before, so at first it was chaos. Everybody talked over everybody else, and when nobody could be heard, they all grew angry. Egos swelled, and they began to hurl insults at each other. They swore that they could never work together, and threatened to return home, call up their warriors, and take to the warpath again. The peacemaker refused to let his life's mission be torn apart in an afternoon. He sat the envoys down around the longhouse fire and declared that they must behave like brothers. The Mohawk and the Seneca were the elder brothers, who sat on one side of the fire and considered new proposals first. If they approved, the issue would then pass to the younger brothers, the Cayuga and the Oneida, who sat on the other side of the fire. And when they took turns like this, everyone's voice would be heard. In short, he established a bicameral legislature. There was no place yet for the Onondaga, so Hiawatha sat with the Mohawks. It had been years since he'd left his homeland, and since he had joined the peacemaker, the Mohawks had welcomed him as one of their own. Now, his place among them allowed him to be one of the first to review new proposals. He quickly helped to resolve the matter of the 2 Seneca chiefs to the far west. The Seneca would be honored as keepers of the western door. The Mohawk became keepers of the eastern door. When strangers approached, the keepers would be the first to judge them, and could call up the warriors from all 5 nations if they thought it necessary. But their first responsibility would be to offer peace to all who came, and welcome those who accepted it. Only those who refused the offer 3 times would be met with war. The chiefs accepted this, and the Seneca joined the Great Peace. Then Hiawatha made another proposal, one that he believed would convince Tadadaho to accept a treaty and join the final nation to their cause. Debate raged around the fire, but Hiawatha urged them all to keep an open mind. They had secured the eastern and western doors, but there could not be peace among them as long as the Onondaga, who lived in the middle, did not accept it. So the council put its faith in Hiawatha's plan. They all returned to the Onondaga together and met with Tadadaho. His temper flared when he saw the envoys from the Cayuga, whom he had so often bullied, now apparently joining forces against him. Even though he knew he was outnumbered, he immediately rose from his bench and threatened to crush them all with war. "We have not come for war," Hiawatha said, "but to make you an offer. We want you to be the leader of our council." Tadadaho sat back down. This was Hiawatha's suggestion. Tadadaho would have the seat of honor and hold a veto over all the laws which the Council of Nations considered. Including him, the Onondaga would have 14 representatives at the council, more than any other tribe. In terms of the great longhouse the peacemaker wanted to build, the Onondaga would be the keepers of the fire. They would have the last vote on all proposals, and council meetings would always be held on their land. Tadadaho's mind spun with the possibilities. Through war, he had been able to claim more and more power for himself, but nowhere near as much as he stood to gain through this treaty. 4 nations wanted to stand before him and offer him the ability to decide their laws for them. How powerful he would become. While these thoughts were swirling through his head, Jigonsase stepped forward. She hadn't believed that Tadadaho could be reformed, but the peacemaker did, and she trusted the peacemaker. Even so, she could see the evil ideas slithering through his mind, and knew that she must put a stop to them. She walked straight up to him, looked him in the eye, and ordered him to strike her. Aghast and confused, Tadadaho looked around. Who was this woman to give him orders like this, and such orders? He couldn't strike a woman, especially a clan mother, and he told her so. Is that not what you do? Jigonsase challenged. I have heard many tales of your power, of how you, a powerful man, strike the women in your longhouse, how you make men afraid of you by threatening their lives. Why should you now hesitate to do to me what you have done to so many others? Isn't that what your power is for? Will that not be how you lead our people? Tadadaho bowed his head in shame. Suddenly he saw all of his plans for what they were, greedy and cruel. He begged for forgiveness. Jigonsase saw that spark of goodness take light in him, and filled with mercy she ran her hands through his hair and soothed him like a mother soothes her child. Now that Tadadaho was ready to listen, Hiawatha explained the rest of his proposal. All votes of the council would be unanimous. In effect, they all had veto power, and all the nations would be equal, but Tadadaho would vote last, and as the leader they all looked to, he had a responsibility to use his veto only when he could give a strong reason for his refusal. Tadadaho agreed, and at last the Onondaga joined the Great Peace. All 5 nations now agreed to peace, but it remained for them to finalize the laws of their new confederacy. Jigonsase, with her knowledge of every nation, sat with the women's councils and decided which of the former war chiefs would now become council representatives. These men were given antlers to represent their new position, and the women who put them there received strings of Hiawatha's wampum beads, signifying the fact that whoever they might choose to sit on the council, the seat itself belonged to the women. All these representatives gathered for the first time on the shores of Onondaga Lake, where the peacemaker awaited them. Before the meeting began, he asked one of the warriors for an arrow from his quiver. Then he held up the arrow and snapped it. "See how easily this breaks?" he told them. Then he asked for a warrior from each of the 5 nations to give him an arrow. Bundling these 5 together, he bent them with all of his strength, but the 5 arrows together held firm. "When we are united," he explained, "we cannot be broken." Before they could begin the council, however, the peacemaker insisted that all of them cast away their weapons and commit their minds to peace. He chose a white pine tree whose needles grew in bunches of 5. All the warriors uprooted the tree, buried their weapons under its roots, and then replanted it, and became lawmakers instead. An eagle came to perch on this new tree of peace, and the peacemaker explained that it would watch over them and sound a warning if danger approached. Centuries later, men like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington would sit down with the descendants of the first Haudenosaunee Council to learn how they had governed themselves for so many generations. They studied the Great Law of Peace, and later they adapted many of its principles into the U.S. Constitution. As a tribute, they adopted the eagle as their national symbol, and placed a bundle of 13 arrows in its claws, one for each colony of the new United States of America. But that's a story for another time. Back to Hiawatha. The council began to draft laws forged by the lessons the peacemaker had taught them. He had always insisted that the government must function for the will of the people, so they decreed that leaders must evaluate how each new law would affect the people for 7 full generations. If they failed in their duties, they would be warned, and then removed from office. Only clan mothers like Jigonsase could appoint a new leader, and the peacemaker believed that government only functioned if everyone had a role and a voice, so the men's and the women's council of each clan received the power to propose laws. As the constitution took shape, Hiawatha wove together strings of wampum to commemorate the new laws. Holding the wampum would help people remember, he hoped, the spirit of each law, and the council that passed it. Determined to create something grander than the simple string he had given the peacemaker at their first meeting, Hiawatha designed a broad belt that would become the symbol of the Confederacy. White lines of peace connected the 5 nations of the Confederacy, with the Onondaga at the center, represented by the Tree of Peace. Those lines extended to the edge of the belt, for he hoped that the Great Peace would extend outwards to other nations, an invitation which the Tuscarora Nation accepted in 1722. Haudenosaunee history is seldom told outside of their own traditions, but the legacy of Hiawatha remains a vibrant one. His name and the name of his fellow council members survive as titles given to the council leaders who inherited their seats, and a man called Tadadaho leads the council to this day. The original Tadadaho followed through on his promise to Jigonsase, and became a leader that the Haudenosaunee could be proud of, as well as proof of the peacemaker's conviction that men forged in war still carried peace in their hearts. As for the peacemaker, he alone had no successor, for he explained that other men could counsel the people, but none could do as he had done in founding the Great Law of Peace. His work here was done. Thank you again to Dominations for sponsoring Extra History and making these episodes.
The The great peace that we are seeking is to stop the violence, to corral our resources, to bring ourselves together so that we can have great power. We have 45 million people spread out over this country, but mainly in the Black Belt and in the big cities like Chicago and New York and New Jersey. When all of these different factors, whether they're Muslim or Moors, whatever they are, declare their independence and agree to come into the Confederation, uh, this is because we have to do it by consent. Everyone can sit at the table of peace. The killings and the poverty that we now endure will stop. We are throwing away our votes to a useless system that we can obtain no returns from. Our votes go into electing white leaders who control us, and they don't give us anything in return. In this election, there's none of our issues in this election. There's nothing on our poverty gap, on the wealth gap, on our education gap, on things that affect us, on reparations, things that affect us and that we're entitled to. We don't have. The UN could come in for days, but unless we do them ourselves, unless we organize ourselves and come together through consent, written consent, this peace won't happen. This power that we have, this great power of billions and billions of dollars a year. And we're going to talk about that next week. One of our defenders, which I call our clan mothers, because our women have an ability to take the testosterone out the room, to get us to stop arguing. And I can't say that I'm not guilty of that. And I'm trying to refrain because this is a peaceful exercise. So every time we go to a group, it's an organization or a tribe, it's in peace. Let me show you the terms of the Confederacy, because this is what's going to um, go out to the I hope I can. I've already downloaded the file. Let me see if I can get it up there for you. Oh my God. Okay. Okay. Um, Email me for the terms. But I could, and I don't know if you could see them. And I'm sharing the file, but I don't know if you can see it on your screen or not. But there are terms of the Confederation that we will come in peace, that we will protect each other, that we will share resources. These resources are immense. Once we sign this great peace treaty amongst all of our people, or amongst as many people as who are intelligent enough to understand that we have to have a structure for unity. We just can't say we need unity. We actually have to have terms of peace that we sign and we commit to, so that there's no um, ignitement of hostilities in Chicago. So there's no in New Jersey or Florida, that we combine our strength. Now, when we do that as international lawyers and defenders, we can move this thing through the United Nations. Last week, no, about 3 weeks ago, we filed for decolonization. And that's going to be the next series after this, when we really get into decolonization. What that does is that puts us into position for huge amounts of infrastructure funds. The Palestinians have a decolonization fund of $6 billion. Of course, we need more. We might need 10 billion, $15 billion, because we have water problems all over our Confederacy, in Detroit, in Flint, all over the South. We have sewage, we have bad sewage, we have environmental problems. Of course, we have this wealth problems. We have the problem with our children. We have the problem with our men and our women being employed. So these funds are for roads, these for transportation, for our schools, education. These are called infrastructure funds. This is for our health, for farms, urban farms, agricultural farms, so that we can feed ourselves. These are subsistence farms and funds. And the reason why this is and the reason why we did this is because once we made that filing, and once we get into that position as a people that needs to be decolonized, and that's the other reason for the signing of the Declaration, is to make us into a people, a united people. Once we get into that posture, we will be able to obtain the infrastructure funds to assist our people, and we would now move to another level in what we call nationalism. This gives us an existence that now we have the dignity, and our indignities would drastically reduce, because now we have been put into a posture where we would be sitting at the table with the United States on the other side, and we would be negotiating the terms of our relationship. And this relationship is called a free association relationship, which is absolutely legal. And this is another reason why we've chosen it, because it means that we would have a relationship with the United States. We would be independent in our areas, in our Black Bear areas, in our areas in the cities, like Chicago has two pockets, huge pockets of African descendants that are now have been recognized as indigenous, have now been recognized as being on the UN decolonial list, and now we can negotiate our terms of state and federal funding, because we're still United States citizens. So we retain are moving to a dual citizenship status. We have a status in our Confederacy, and we have a status in the United States. And that's what the Hawaiians have with the United States. It's very vast. This is what the Micronesians, these are former colonies of the United States. Hawaiians, former colony of the United States, the Hawaiian indigenous people. The Virgin Islands, a former colony. They are in the decolonization process. Puerto Rico is in this in-between process, but now has moved more toward the free association uh, uh, platform, because they were totally dissatisfied of the U.S. response. So now they're seeking independence rather than being the 51st state. The Marshall Islands, have moved into a free association relationship with the United States, where they remain independent. They still obtain state and federal funding for their taxes. They couldn't vote, but we vote. What does this mean now? We always talked about a block vote. Now we have a block vote. We can put in and take out presidents, because we're united now. We can put in and take out governors, the things that's happening in Florida, in Georgia, no problem now, because we have a blocked existence. And this existence is a wealthy existence now. Now our communities don't look like they looked like before. They are being rehabilitated. The people who are rehabilitating is our workers. So they're making the new roads. They are refurbishing the houses, the schools, all of the government and necessary things that we need: transportation, communication, all of that, food security. All of that is in our hands now. This thing called politics is a exercise of who gets what, and we haven't been getting anything because our vote is not configured right. So when we do this, and and it's just a matter of signing the declaration, requesting for decolonization. We have the forms on our site, and they're readily available to you. And we're picking up more Confederates every day, but they don't have the benefit that you've had of this explanation. Of course, they will now, because now this is on YouTube. This automatically goes down to YouTube. So if you want to replay this, go to YouTube, and you can replay this. And make sure you make your notes, because everything that we say is verifiable. That's just our training. We don't say anything, and I have not said anything to you, and I never will. Just the training unless I can prove it. So what we start off with, our status, who we are, all of that has to be established for land rights. We're talking about billions, and trillions of dollars and a whole change in our destiny, because we'll talk about that in future lessons. The United States has pigeonholed us. The deep state has pigeonholed us for this year 2053, where we have zero wealth. We're losing wealth every day. We're losing assets every day that we don't do this. We cannot be indecisive. I am deputizing everyone that's listening and everyone that listens to our YouTube to be able to explain this, explain it to your family, explain it to your organization, so that we can enter this great treaty of peace called a confederation. This makes us strong. We are wasting our numbers. We are a paper tiger. We're 45 million people with no power, very little power, and we're going to go into this power transfer next week with one of the clan mothers who want to be one of the clan mothers, that Cecile Johnson, who is now a UN human rights defender. She is going to explain how much money that we're losing in our areas because we don't control the money and it's going into their pockets. The building of a nation is what creates wealth. That's what creates the great wealth of the world. The reason why the United States is a superpower is because of our labor that has not been come back to us, and the exploitation of us in our own lands. They are taking our soil, they're taking our bodies, they're taking our tax dollars and becoming filthy rich while we become extremely poor. This is an extremely poor way to do politics. Of course, no one has taught us. The political scientists have failed us. Of course, we're going to the colleges, explain this to the African American Studies departments, the political science departments, HBCUs, because their curricula is really inefficient. They talk about Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era, which is dead because of the Supreme Court and because Congress is Caucasian. Of course, affirmative action dead, reparations doesn't come up because we don't control that. We can control ourselves. Self-determination is an absolute right that the United States has ratified. Let me repeat that. Self-determination, and let me give it another name, Black nationalism, self-determination is something that the United States has ratified. They just think that we're too ignorant. In fact, Trump used that term last week. Not last week, but his attorney told him that we're too stupid to understand politics. That's what's going on. That's what they think, that we're too stupid to understand how to run politics, how to understand politics. Some of our greatest minds, it looks like, are going on in CNN, NBC, and we think, oh, they're so smart. They're talking about the midterms and such. But to a midterm for what? There are no issues that we can eat from at the table. This, on the other hand, allows us to eat and eat good. When we talk about bringing $10 billion, and that's just infrastructure money, but as we build our infrastructure and build our schools so our children now can be turned on by school, they'll pick up their pants. They'll stop being so insolent toward us and disrespectful. And the reason why they're doing that now, and I don't blame them, is because we have not protected them. We have not thought enough of a way out of this to protect them. There is this way out of it. We must take this opportunity to come out of this configuration into this new configuration. Please take the time to study, go back over the replays until you understand it. Write us, let us know. This is going to be a building block process. Next week is going to be explosive because we're going to give you the data on where we're at now: health, education, wealth, incarceration, and how many billions of dollars that they are putting in their pockets as a result of this. Even on incarceration, they're putting billions of dollars in their pocket because they wield the police power. In this configuration, we wield the police power. We police our own people. we're able to get state and federal funds to do that. Because why? We're United States citizens. The same areas that we lived in before, we still live in. The same funding that you've given the other guys who used to run us now have to come to us because we're taking control over the areas. We're taking control over. Detroit has joined us. That's 700,000 African descendants. 700,000 African descendants. We have Detroit because they're so dissatisfied. We have Chicago. They're so dissatisfied. We have New York. They're so dissatisfied. We're dissatisfied with no options because we are thinking that we're Democrats. And no, how can we be Democrats when that means democracy? And our areas are not democratized. This is a great democratization process in which we will be putting in our own constitutions. I'm going to make sure I'm going to put it up on our website so you can get the terms of the Confederacy. And these are just the starting terms of the Confederacy, because the parliament that's being put in place are going to be put in place by you, not by me. We'll have an interim government, and then the elected government shortly after, about a year and a half after, 2 years at the most. You will be given an opportunity to vote and nominate people from your area to come to our Senate, to come to our House of Representatives, because the diagram of and how we construct this is going to be based upon our very existence in our Americas and the United States. We're going to have Senate, House of Representatives, Supreme Courts, appellate courts. We're going to have a government, Secretary of State, Attorney General, all of that. All of that. That's what we need to do in order to control our areas and control this great wealth. We have $1.4 trillion in income every year. The realization of that and puts us at the 12th wealthiest entity in the whole world. We're richer than Nigeria. We're richer than most of the African states put together. We're rich. We're right there with Iran. We have as much money as Iran. They have a nuclear power, and they're considered an emerging power. We have that much money in potential money just based upon this reconfiguration. When we reconfigure this through voting, not through war, through peace, this is a great peace. We want to come to everyone in peace. All of our churches, we want to come to them in peace. All of our mosques, we want to come to them in peace and ask them to join this great peace treaty. We want to go to the gang leaders in Chicago and ask them to join this great peace. In New York, we want to ask our children. We want them, the ones that are in college and are voting, we want them to, the Black student unions, we want them to join this great peace. When we do that, we will have great power. We will finally be able to participate in democracy. We've never known democracy. Believe me, look over the time periods. We have never known true democracy. We've never participated in a true democracy. We have the opportunity now. We have that opportunity now. Dr. King said, now we went through phase 1 and phase 2. We got out of the Jim Crow era, was trying to put us back into it. But we got out of that era. We went into the era where we elected so-called leaders. That didn't work. This era is of genuine equality. When we do this, we'll have a genuine equality with those with the white man who oppressed us. We no longer go to them and ask them for programs. Can you give us this program? Can you give us that? We need more education dollars. And they just, no, especially the Trump administration. Can we seat our children in your school? No, the Supreme Court. We sit down at the table now and we negotiate. And we negotiate according to what you tell us to do. We want a term on self-defense. We want ports. We want that port. We want this port under the Confederation. We want defense dollars for this and that. We want a treaty with the understanding with the Homeland Security, because we're going to defend our areas with self-defense. We want a understanding on education. During this transition period, our children can go to the major universities while we build our own curriculums in universities. These are the things. If you want us to negotiate like that, believe me, I'm looking forward to it. We're looking forward to it. We're looking to negotiate. Don't want to beg. This is not a begging enterprise. So after these 14 weeks, this is just week 3. After these 14 weeks, believe me, you are going to understand the predicament and the potentialities out of this predicament like you never had before, because you can't get this in your college. You can't get this in your high school. You can't get this anywhere but right here. Please take this book. This is one of your starting points. It's only $20. This is going to explain racial identity politics. And what we are engaging in is basically what America engages in: racial identity politics. This is all the issues that are presently on the slate of both parties are issues that concern them because they identify them. This is a way that we can obtain billions of dollars in reparations. This book is about the reparations process, and it explains the configuration that we in and what we need to do as well. The next book is called "The Last American Slave Colony and Decolonization." The filing that we just did is in that book, as well as the relationship, the legalities of the relationship to the United States and the relationships the United States have with Guam and the American Indians, and that we desire to, which is they don't. Some of them don't have it. Some of them are members of Commonwealth and still being really controlled by the U.S. We want a free association pact, and we can do it because we have the power. 45 million people that are unified is a great power. It's a great power block. So now we can stop talking about unity because we signed an agreement to unify. We signed a peace treaty. We signed an agreement to sit in council together, and so that we can distribute our own funds to the areas in which need to be distributed to. This is great power. This is democracy. So they can't. So there's no way for the U.S. to attack us frontally because this is democracy. This is how it's done. The problem is no one has ever spoken to you like this and explained it to you in detail and showed you how it's done and showed you why. And we are just on lesson 3. We have 13 more weeks to go. And please do not miss a week. And if you just have to, make sure you go to YouTube, get our replay. There's nothing to hide. We're going to talk about this in the international courts. We're going to talk about this in Congress. We're going to talk about this every opportunity that we can leading up to the final negotiations. And I say final because once we have this free association compact with the U.S., we're free. We're wealthy. We have our children in good schools. We have our people to work because they're not putting you to work. They're lying to you. They're lying to you. The technology has advanced so much. Now there are going to be lesser jobs. Robotics, there's not going to be any people in McDonald's in 3 to 5 years. You're going to go to McDonald's and have machines give you your food. There's not going to be any Lyft drivers or Uber drivers. The cars are going to be moved by remote control. They're fooling you. They're lying to you. The job sector is going to dry up, and they have us pigeonholed for zero wealth by 2053. Unless we turn this thing around, give labor-intensive jobs to us because we're unskilled. So we have to put all of our people to work, building roads, cleaning up the neighborhoods, manning putting it into our police departments, our government offices, street cleaning, all of building houses, doing electric work, all of the things that they are coming in our community to do for us, we'll be doing for ourselves in this configuration. So please study this. You are deputized. to go into your organizations to talk about this. You are, and you will get further training. So thank you very, very much. I know I went a little bit over, but this is one of those weeks when we have this type of topic that we may go a little bit over. I usually like to keep it down to an hour, but we just couldn't do it today. And we're trying it, but it's going to be very explosive next week because we're going to actually trace the money and these monies and these billions of dollars that are laying on the table. We're going to talk about how we bring them to the Confederacy so that we can operate and redistribute those funds to the issues that plague us. So I thank you so much. Thank you very much for being patient with us today. We'll see you next week. Get the book. It's on our websites. It's $20. You will see how astute this approach is, and you'll understand why this is what's needed at this time. So again, I thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much for your attendance.